Harvard professor Tony Saich, a most renowned China scholar, director of the Ash Center. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
So today we are going to take a random walk down Chinese Communist Party's history with Tony and have the privilege to ask him thoughtful questions about Chinese history and the China's future. Now, Tony, long divided countries must unite, and long united country must divide, as you quoted very well in your book. And this certainly has not been the case for the Western side of Eurasia. Ever since the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Western part of Eurasia has never been able to unite together. But this has very much been the Chinese belief and indeed China's political experience. So what has made that difference that makes one end of a continent manage to unite after long separation, and on the other side, it's not necessarily the case?
Even going back into the imperial period, the idea of a Han ethnic core that defines Chinese civilization. And we see that reflected in literature, we see it reflected in a whole set of philosophical writings, and also with the notion of Tianxia as being a ruling principle from Beijing. But of course, what happened in more recent history, starting from the Opium Wars on, China, of course, was dismembered. Different parts fell under the rule of warlords. Different parts of China were really effectively under the rule of foreign countries, even though it was never formally, in that sense, a colony. And I think an important part of the Chinese Communist Party's struggle was to try and bring back some kind of dignity and integrated sovereignty for China. Now, the China is chosen, of course, is really one of the most expansive definitions of China, really, which comes from the late Qing dynasty, to include really an all-embracing view of what should be part of contemporary China. So, with the exception of Mongolia, it has really incorporated most of those lands into control under the government in Beijing. So it's been a long historical road, a windy road, a twisty road. And I think, as you know, there are still disputes about what is really core China, what is peripheral China, and what might be excluded from China. And definitions have changed around that historically over time, even including for the Chinese Communist Party, which when it was getting ready to make the push for rule in the northwest of China, up in Yan'an, it defined Mongolia as an integral part of Chinese territory, but not Taiwan, for example. And yet today, of course, Taiwan is a flashpoint in China's relations with the United States and many other countries around the world. Mm-hmm. But I think it is underpinned by not just a common language, which is being spread out across the country, but a definition of culture, a definition of history, which traces its roots back into thousands of years of history.
Now, going back to the line that you quoted, Tony, long united countries must divide. If indeed that is true, what does that imply to China's future?
Well, it's an interesting question and a difficult one to answer, to be honest. One might say that from Beijing's perspective, it is divided at the moment. It's pushed hard to reintegrate Hong Kong and Macau back into basically mainland control. It still sees Taiwan as being outside of its control. So from that perspective, it might well claim it's divided. But I think there's a more fundamental issue, and that is, how do you manage and how do you rule from a basically central government in a vast land which has different cultures, which has different languages, and lives under different geographies? In that context, there were fears in the 1990s that perhaps China might fall apart. I don't think it was ever really realistic, but a number of writers started talking about a possible implosion of Chinese rule, the possibility that some of the more integrated provinces with the world outside in the south, such as Guangdong, might have an incentive to break away from Beijing's rule. And of course, that never happened. Under the Communist Party rule, the organization department keeps a pretty strong control over appointments. It also has very strong financial control, which gives it budgetary capabilities and, of course, military force, which can help keep it integrated. But that's all the story as long as things are going well. What we do know is historically, China has probably been divided as long as it's been united. And I don't think one can ever rule that out in the future. It takes great statecraft. It's very complex and it's very demanding and challenging.
That's certainly very interesting. As strong as China looks to the outside world, China from the inside is actually quite fragile.
I think we often gloss over about China is it is made up of multiple cultures, not just that of the Uyghurs, not just that of, say, Tibetan Buddhists. But, Cantonese culture is very different from Sichuanese culture, is different from Shanghai, is different from the heavy hand of Beijing, for example. Parts of the coast, parts of the south have always been more globally engaged, more trading. And that's often produced a more entrepreneurial climate in those areas. I think it's not surprising that the nationalist movement under Sun Yat-sen, it got its first strengths in those sort of trading areas in the south of China. The Chinese Communist Party formed its roots in the much more cosmopolitan atmosphere of Shanghai. It was far less successful, where there was a much more traditional pattern of rule in Beijing. And remember, we only have to go back 60, 70, well, probably 80 years, and China was divided as a patchwork of rule under different warlords, and really power only extended as far as the army reached. So the idea of an ongoing monolithic integrated China of 2,000, 5,000 years certainly is mythic.
Is mythic. That's very interesting. Chinese culture was an open culture, as you refer to in the book, during the Han, Tang, and Song dynasties. And essentially from Han to Song dynasties, that was a time span crossing over a millennia. So what essentially, Tony, has made China lose that global openness, that open vision, and become inward looking?
Even since 1949, China's not consistently been inward looking. There's been periods of sort of openness in different ways. I mean, China was engaging globally in the 60s, even the Cultural Revolution, when it was trying to promote its own sort of Maoist view of revolution. It was supporting revolutionary groups around the world. In the 1950s, it saw a role of globalization for it as a leader of the developing countries in the South, for example. So there have been sort of different ways of Chinese Communist Party wishing to engage. And then, of course, what we saw after the reform started in 1978, a tremendous progressive opening to the world outside, where not just investment came in and foreign companies, but also a whole range of different ideas. And remember, after all, Marxism is a Western concept, not necessarily one that was generated within China itself. Now, of course, it's talked about socialism with Chinese characteristics and so forth. But essentially, it is an ideology generated from a global revolutionary movement, which originated outside of China's boundaries. But in the more recent period, I mean, through the 80s and into the 90s, I would say there was a tremendous range of opening in terms of not just business commerce, but also students traveling abroad, foreigners coming to study, to work in China. And, I think we shouldn't underestimate that. I think there's still, 250,000, 350,000 Chinese students studying abroad. So it's not as if, China has sort of cut itself off and isolated. Mm-hmm. But I do think over the last, I would say, 12, 13 years, there has been a significant shift from Beijing from what it thinks it can learn from the world outside and its interactions from the world outside. And I think that had been growing for a while as China's power had increased. But I think it was particularly sparked by the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. I'm sure you must have your experiences of that, Shirley, but many people I knew in China who were actually, sympathetic to the West, felt that perhaps there were many things that China could learn from the West. They began to question that. They began to think, well, how could this country, which was supposed to be admiring the United States, have brought us to this mess through the global financial crisis? And then I think we see not necessarily so much an inward turn, but more a turn looking that, well, perhaps the model we have might be appropriate for China's situation.
Right.
But perhaps we should look more to our own history, our own traditions, our own culture, rather than taking on board some of these concepts, ideas, ideological streams from the West. And I think the recent leadership in China really has doubled down on that in the sense of this works, we're going to stick with it. We don't need to be told by the foreigners any longer how to behave, how we should value our currency, what is the appropriate economic model we should be adopting, what is industrial policy. And I think that is seen from the outside as somewhat of a closing off of China from the world outside. I think we see other strains of it, a much more asserted nationalism coming from Beijing, defending what it sees as its principal positions. We also see a much more concerted attempt, also over the last decade, with things like Made in China 2025, which if foreign businesses didn't realize it before, China is certainly going to make sure that its companies dominate important domestic production capabilities within China, and that the foreigners will merely play a marginal role and a supplemental role in that process. And, cutting off from the outside world has been going on for a while in China. I think it decided early on to develop its own systems. China decided to ban Twitter, Google, Facebook, which would have allowed a much more open global conversation and to focus on developing its own technologies. It's done the same with GPS systems. Mm-hmm. So I think it's been made clear that, China wants to develop its own systems that run parallel to those being used in much of the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Contemporary China post 1978 has certainly been thriving on its reform and opening up. However, Tony, you just talked about innovation. China, all of a sudden, in the past 20 years, have become this very innovative power and essentially one of the global innovation superpower today. But it seems that China has done more innovation in the past 20 years than it's done in the past centuries. So where do we trace this innovation spirit in the Chinese culture?
Well, I don't know. I think there's always been, in part, a kind of entrepreneurial drive amongst parts of the Chinese population. I talked about it before that, certainly in the south of China, there's a much more entrepreneurial, innovative approach. And I think it's not surprising that many of those innovative entrepreneurial setups have been in places like Hangzhou and Zhejiang, or they've been in the south in places like Shenzhen, where it's been much more open and much more accommodating to that kind of entrepreneurial spirit. I think what has led to it is a couple of different things. One is without doubt China's engagement with the world outside. If you think about a lot of those innovative processes, I'm not an expert in this area, but many of them didn't really start in China. They often started by people bringing ideas back into China and then tinkering with them and actually being phenomenally successful at pushing those innovations forward. But then, of course, they were very heavily aided by the government in Beijing, which basically built protective barriers around them that stopped the global competition in some of those areas. And given, a market of 1.3 billion people, that could allow expansion without having to compete globally. And it has been extraordinary. There is no doubt about it. That innovation which has taken place where, China leads in a number of areas, digital currencies, online payments, some of the AI areas, some of the robotic areas, and so forth. It's been an extraordinary explosion of innovation. I think the question becomes whether the government is willing to leave it alone. Or does the government get worried and begin to insist that the state begins to take a controlling interest and a controlling stake in some of those new industries? And that may lead to a dampening of that innovation. I mean, where the state has tried to push things, such as the semiconductor business, in which it's invested huge amounts of money, from what I read from outside, the results have not been that successful.
Very interesting. Tony, you talked about Marxism. It's actually certainly not an indigenous concept from China. But China says that China has been the world's only consistent, uninterrupted civilization over millennia. So Chinese culture was, in a way, certainly disrupted by Marxism, but more anciently by the introduction of Buddhism.
Yeah.
So is Chineseness, this whole understanding about the Chinese civilization, as pure as what Chinese portray today?
Well, I think like any culture, it is a mix of different influences. I think one of the interesting questions is, why was Buddhism, in a sense, absorbed and taken over in China, where certain branches of Christianity were not? And I think that sort of says a lot about the way these thought systems became integrated. And I think if you look at Marxism, if the Chinese Communist Party had lost the Civil War, Marxism wouldn't be there in China, except maybe in some sort of radical groups that might still be kicking around. But of course, the way it was justified was that Mao Zedong was able to signify Marxism. And I think that's a telling point, because it was saying that what we did was we adapted it to fit China's actual situation. And of course, we see that strand going right through into the present, that what this has been is a continual process of adaptation. And whereas, in 1949, both the Chinese Communist Party and Marxism were presented as a radical break with the past. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It was going to build a completely different society. It rejected, the Chinese tradition, all the various evils that were related to that. I was a student in China at the end of the Pilin Picong phase, criticized Lin Biao and Confucius campaigns. And certainly there it saw itself as a radical break with the past. And yet now we see the current leader of China talking about the Communist Party not being necessarily that radical break, but the inheritor of all that is good within the Chinese tradition, and actually praising things like Confucius. Not excessively, and to some extent it's a caricature of Confucian thought, but saying, this and other philosophies are a part of the Chinese tradition. So I think that pull of the tradition is immensely strong. And in a way that perhaps, Marxism doesn't appeal to many of the Chinese people. Vague references to the Chinese culture, Chinese civilization, millennia of history, perhaps, evokes a more positive response than talking about dictatorship of the proletariat and class struggle and so on and so forth.
Tony, from your experience, how much of a role does Marxism still play within, say, Communist Party members or amongst the Chinese youth?
That's a really interesting question. I think there's different dynamics to that. One of the things is that we do see Xi Jinping stressing Marxism as being important. As the head of something that causes the Communist Party, it would be difficult not to stress that. And he's talked about, universities should be training the youth in Marxism for the future. But of course, those young people in the universities who also saw it as a guide to action were very quickly made to realize that wasn't the intention. So those that went down to organize workers in the south of China and started setting up Marxist studies societies very quickly had those thoughts dashed. So clearly not necessarily a guide to action in terms of exploitation, classes, inequalities, and so forth. But does it still impact today? I think the answer to that has to be yes, because it sets certain boundaries around what is feasible. Xi Jinping talks a lot about historical materialism. And what he understands by that is that there's an inevitable process of history going through stages, and that what historical materialism is telling Communist Party members is that the East is rising and the West is declining. And that's an inevitable historical narrative that comes from his reading of historical materialism. In terms of other factors, it justifies certain things. One is the existence of a Leninist party, which is, of course, crucial to Chinese Communist Party rule. I think it also dictates certain practices within the economy, where despite the massive growth of the private sector from the 80s, 90s onwards, is always seen as less important than the state-owned sector. So I think the question of ownership of the means of production, as it's talked about in Marxist jargon, becomes important, and that the state, therefore, both domestically and globally, should play the predominant role. I think one can argue, is that Marxist? Is it part of the Chinese tradition? But I think the preference for the collective over the individual, I think, is a strong feature. It's not to say that individual rights have not increased significantly since late 1970s, but I think there is always a preference for the collective over the individual. And I think one sees that in a number of policy areas. And I think one sees it in terms of one of the phrases that's become more common in China recently, the defense of its system as being majoritarianism, and that the will of the majority should rule.
Tony, from my personal experience, I see many Communist Party members during the daytime in the office. They are Communist Party members, but then they would go to the temples and bow to Buddhas, and they would hand a little Buddha hearts, etc. So I guess, how do you reconcile that belief system?
Well, I think there's a couple of things I would say to that. One, when I was interviewing local government officials and I got really bored with the conversation, I would just say, so what does this have to do with Marxism then? And you would think that I'd hit them with a baseball bat. They really didn't know what to say. They didn't know what to answer. So how do I reply to your question? I think it depends not only on the individual, but place and so forth. And it reminds me very much of traditional China. And what I mean by that is often in traditional China, you had an official narrative, which was the Confucian narrative. And that went up and down the system. You had the mandates, which were passed down. You'd go into villages, you'd see the couplets, hanging on the wall with some kind of Confucian saying on them, which is not that different from when you go into a village now and you see the Marxist couplets down the side of the wall expressing something to the glory of Xi Jinping or whatever the latest policy is. But then when you think about life at that very local level, horizontal relations actually is often the way that people live. And so while they might be passing up Confucian messages, the environment they're living in might be dominated by the temple, the miao or the hui. And that might be the way they're communicating with people, is in a kind of a horizontal way with a different narrative from that of the official rhetoric. And, it's in many areas, the clan really rules the roost. Now, the head of the party secretary might be the head of the clan. But then it raises really interesting questions. Is the party secretary bringing the party into the clan or the clan into the party? And I suspect the answer is both. But ultimately, I'm not predicting a demise for the Chinese Communist Party. But one of the things you do know, if it ever goes away, the clan is going to be there. And the Communist Party may or not be.
Very interesting.
One last thing I was going to say on that is ago. It must have been in the 1990s. So it was after the Soviet Union had collapsed. And many in China thought the Chinese Communist Party might be next. And I was having a lunch in Southwest China with a local party official. And we were in a courtyard and people were dancing and singing or whatever. And we were eating. And I looked around and I really thought, if this guy is still going to run this area, no matter whoever is in charge in Beijing, and he will adapt to whatever it is Beijing is telling him is to be done. And as we know, there are certain things you have to do, which are priority demands from the center. But much of the rest of the time is just, finding space, working your way around things to do what is best for yourself and hopefully for your local community.
Harvard professor Tony Saich, From Rebel to Ruler, coming onto the market on July 1st. Check it out and enjoy the fascinating read. Thank you so much, Tony.